In 1989, 5 teenagers were convicted of a brutal assault in New York City's Central Park, a case that would later become known as the Central Park Five. Based substantially on confessions the teenagers themselves had given to police during hours of interrogation. More than a decade later, DNA evidence definitively proved that none of the 5 teenagers had committed the crime. A different man, already in prison for other offenses, confessed to acting alone and was matched conclusively by DNA. The 5 original confessions, given after extended interrogation without the presence of a lawyer or parent for critical periods, had been entirely false. This case, along with hundreds of subsequent documented instances of false confession identified through DNA exoneration, points toward one of the most unsettling findings in the psychology of human testimony. Human beings will, under certain identifiable conditions, confess to crimes they did not commit, sometimes providing detailed, seemingly credible accounts of events that never happened. But the psychology of confession extends far beyond the specific and extreme case of false confessions under police interrogation. It touches something more general and more pervasive about human psychology, a deep, often uncontrollable drive to disclose, to admit, to tell someone what we have done, even when remaining silent, would be considerably safer, considerably wiser, and would carry no practical cost whatsoever. Understanding why human beings confess, both truthfully and, in the most troubling cases, falsely, reveals something fundamental about the psychological architecture underlying guilt, social bonding, and the basic human need to be known. Let's begin with the everyday, non-criminal psychology of confession, because it turns out to illuminate something the extreme forensic cases alone cannot. The psychologist James Pennebaker at the University of Texas at Austin has spent decades studying what he calls the act of confiding, documenting through extensive experimental and correlational research that the simple act of disclosing a secret, particularly a secret associated with shame or wrongdoing, produces measurable psychological and even physiological benefits. Pennebaker's foundational research found that individuals instructed to write in detail about a traumatic or shameful secret they had never previously disclosed to anyone showed measurable improvements in immune function, reduced doctor visits in subsequent months, and improved psychological well-being, compared to individuals instructed to write about a neutral topic of similar length and complexity. Pennebaker's research proposes that the active suppression of a significant secret requires ongoing psychological and physiological effort, what he calls inhibitory work, a continuous low-level cognitive and physiological cost that accumulates over time and that is measurably relieved by disclosure, regardless of whether that disclosure occurs to another person or, in some of Pennebaker's experimental paradigms, simply through private written expression. This finding suggests that the drive to confess is not simply, or even primarily, a social phenomenon requiring another person's forgiveness or absolution, but reflects something more fundamentally physiological, the ongoing cost of concealment itself, a cost that disclosure measurably relieves. The specific social dimension of confession has been examined by the psychologist Michael Slepian at Columbia University, whose extensive research on the psychology of keeping secrets has documented that it is not primarily the act of secrecy itself that produces psychological burden, as earlier theories including Pennebaker's original inhibitory work framework had proposed, but specifically the mind wandering back to the secret, the frequency and intrusiveness with which a concealed secret involuntarily surfaces in conscious thought outside of the specific social situations in which active concealment is actually required. Slepian's research, involving large-scale studies cataloging the specific secrets people report keeping and how frequently those secrets come to mind, found that secrets associated with feelings of shame specifically, as opposed to secrets that people simply preferred not to share for reasons unrelated to shame, were mentally revisited with dramatically greater frequency and were associated with correspondingly greater psychological distress, even when the two categories of secret required identical levels of active concealment effort in actual social situations. This finding refines the earlier understanding of confession's psychological function considerably. It is not simply the practical burden of hiding information from others that confession relieves, but specifically the recurring, intrusive mental burden of shame-laden thought that a kept secret generates even in complete privacy. This connects to a broader theoretical account of confession's function developed by the psychologist Roy Baumeister, whose extensive research on guilt has documented that guilt functions as what he calls a relationship protective emotion, one whose primary evolutionary function is not simply to produce internal distress as punishment for wrongdoing, but specifically to motivate behaviors, including confession, apology, and reparative action, that repair and preserve valuable social relationships that a person's wrongdoing has placed at risk. Baumeister's research found that guilt is experienced with greatest intensity specifically in the context of close, valued relationships, and that the confession and reparative behavior guilt motivates functions most effectively in terms of actually repairing relational damage when it is voluntary and appears to reflect genuine internal remorse rather than being extracted through external pressure or coercion. This account helps explain a specific and consequential feature of confession that both the everyday and the forensic literature converge on. Confessions that appear spontaneous and voluntary carry dramatically greater social and psychological weight, for both the confessor and the person receiving the confession, than confessions that appear to have been extracted through pressure, threat, or coercion, even when the underlying factual content of the confession is identical in both cases. A voluntary confession functions as a costly and therefore credible signal of genuine remorse and continued commitment to the relationship or social group the wrongdoing has threatened, in a manner directly analogous to the costly signaling logic that behavioral economists have identified in other domains of human cooperative psychology. The forensic psychology of false confession, the phenomenon that opened this video, has been examined in extensive detail by the psychologist Saul Kassin at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, whose decades of research on interrogation-induced false confession has identified several specific psychological mechanisms through which standard, widely used police interrogation techniques can produce confessions to crimes the confessing individual did not actually commit. Kassin's research distinguishes between several categories of false confession, including what he calls compliant false confession, in which an individual confesses despite knowing they are innocent, typically to escape an aversive interrogation situation or in response to an explicit or implicit promise of leniency, and the more psychologically striking category of internalized false confession, in which prolonged, psychologically coercive interrogation actually leads an innocent individual to become genuinely, if temporarily, convinced of their own guilt. Kassin's research has documented specific interrogation techniques, including prolonged isolation, the presentation of fabricated evidence falsely claiming to link the suspect to the crime, and the systematic minimization of the perceived severity of consequences contingent on confession, that measurably increase the likelihood of both compliant and internalized false confession, particularly among vulnerable populations including juveniles, individuals with intellectual disabilities, and individuals experiencing significant psychological distress or sleep deprivation at the time of interrogation, exactly the combination of vulnerabilities present in the Central Park 5 case with which this video began. The psychologist Gisli Gudjonsson at King's College London, whose extensive clinical and forensic research on interrogative suggestibility has been foundational to understanding individual differences in false confession vulnerability, has documented that certain identifiable personality and cognitive characteristics, including heightened general compliance with perceived authority, elevated suggestibility to misleading information, and reduced capacity to tolerate the interpersonal pressure and uncertainty of a prolonged interrogation, predict substantially elevated vulnerability to producing a false confession under standard interrogation conditions, findings that have been influential in reforming interrogation practices and evidentiary standards in multiple legal jurisdictions, specifically to reduce the incidence of false confession-based wrongful conviction. There is a further dimension of this research that deserves careful attention because it addresses a specific question that has significant practical consequences for how confession is understood and evaluated within legal and organizational systems. Why confessions, once given, carry such extraordinary and often disproportionate evidentiary weight, even when independent evidence supporting the confession is weak or absent. The psychologist Saul Kassin, extending his research on false confession specifically to examine how confessions are subsequently evaluated by juries, judges, and even the original investigators who obtained them, has documented what he calls the confession's corrupting effect on the broader evaluation of a case. Kassin's research found that once a confession has been obtained, investigators, prosecutors, and jurors alike show a systematic tendency to interpret ambiguous or even contradictory subsequent evidence in a manner consistent with the confession, a pattern of confirmation bias so powerful that it has been documented to persist even among mock jurors who were explicitly informed that a given confession had been coerced under conditions the jurors themselves would agree constituted duress. Kassin's research found that this corrupting effect operates through several specific mechanisms. Confessions shape how forensic evidence is interpreted by analysts who are not blind to the existence of a confession. They shape how eyewitnesses reconstruct and report their memories of an event. And they shape how investigators subsequently allocate their efforts, often leading to premature closure of an investigation and a corresponding failure to pursue alternative leads that might have identified the actual perpetrator. This finding has significant implications, extending well beyond the individual psychology of why people confess, illuminating why false confessions in particular have proven so difficult to identify and correct even in the presence of substantial contradictory evidence, and why reform efforts in forensic psychology have increasingly focused not simply on preventing false confessions at the point of interrogation, but on structurally insulating the subsequent evaluation of forensic and testimonial evidence from the biasing influence of a confession once one has been obtained. This connects to a broader body of research on what psychologists call the fundamental attribution error, as it specifically applies to confession evidence. Human observers show a strong and well-documented tendency to interpret a person's confession as reflecting genuine internal guilt and stable personal characteristics, while substantially underweighting the powerful situational pressures, including the specific interrogation techniques Kassin has documented, that can produce confession independent of actual guilt. The psychologist Lee Ross at Stanford University, whose foundational research established the fundamental attribution error as one of the most robust and consequential biases in social psychology, has noted that confession evidence represents a particularly potent trigger for this bias, precisely because a confession appears, on its surface, to be the most direct and unambiguous possible evidence of a person's internal mental state, when in fact the psychological research on false confession demonstrates that confession behavior is often more powerfully shaped by external situational pressure than by the confessor's actual guilt or innocence. What is theoretically significant about connecting the forensic false confession literature to the everyday psychology of confession that Pennebaker, Slepian, and Baumeister have documented is that both bodies of research point toward the same underlying psychological reality. Human beings possess an extraordinarily powerful drive to resolve the internal tension generated by a gap between their private knowledge of themselves and their public presentation to others, a drive powerful enough that, under sufficiently extreme conditions of psychological pressure, it can be weaponized to produce confessions to acts a person did not actually commit, and powerful enough that, under the ordinary conditions of everyday life, it reliably produces measurable psychological and physiological relief when a genuine, shame-associated secret is finally disclosed. There is one further dimension of this research worth examining, because it addresses the specific religious and cultural institutionalization of confession that has existed across a remarkably wide range of human societies throughout recorded history. A pattern that suggests the psychological drive toward disclosure, documented in the modern laboratory research, may connect to considerably older and more culturally widespread mechanisms for managing guilt at the level of entire societies rather than simply individual psychology. The anthropologist and religious studies scholar Ara Norenzayan at the University of British Columbia, whose broader research on the evolutionary origins of religious belief we have not yet examined in detail in this series, has documented that formalized confession practices, whether the specific sacramental confession found in Catholic Christianity, the public confession practices found in numerous small-scale traditional societies, or comparable institutions found across an enormously wide range of religious and cultural traditions, appear to serve a common underlying social function, providing a structured, socially sanctioned mechanism through which the psychological pressure toward disclosure that Pennebaker, Slepian, and Baumeister have documented in modern laboratory settings can be channeled in ways that reinforce rather than threaten group cohesion and social order. Norenzayan's research proposes that these institutionalized confession practices solve a specific coordination problem that purely private, unstructured disclosure does not adequately address. They establish clear social expectations about when, how, and to whom disclosure should occur, They typically pair disclosure with a correspondingly clear and socially sanctioned pathway toward forgiveness or reintegration, and they place the disclosure within a broader framework of shared cultural and often supernatural meaning that can provide psychological resources for managing guilt beyond what an unstructured private confession to an ordinary social contact might offer. This account helps explain why formal confession institutions have proven so historically durable and so culturally widespread despite the enormous diversity of religious and social systems in which they have independently emerged. They appear to provide a structured solution to a genuine and evolutionarily ancient psychological problem: the management of guilt-related psychological burden in a manner that supports, rather than undermines, the cohesion of the social group within which an individual's wrongdoing has occurred. The psychologist Fiery Cushman at Harvard University has extended this analysis by examining confession specifically through the lens of costly signaling theory, proposing that the specific features that make institutionalized confession psychologically and socially effective, including its frequent public or semi-public character, the specific vulnerability and loss of control it requires the confessor to accept, and the effort typically involved in reaching and completing the confession, all function to make confession a credible and difficult-to-fake signal of genuine remorse, in a manner directly parallel to the costly signaling mechanisms that behavioral economists, including Ernst Fehr, have identified in other domains of human cooperative psychology that this series has examined previously, including altruistic punishment and the enforcement of fairness norms. On this account, confession is not simply a psychological release valve for individual guilt, but is, at the level of an entire social system, one of the specific mechanisms through which human societies have historically solved the problem of distinguishing genuine remorse and continued cooperative commitment from merely superficial or strategic displays of the same. This costly signaling account of institutionalized confession also helps explain a specific pattern that researchers have documented in the specific content of what people choose to confess when disclosure is genuinely voluntary rather than extracted under pressure. People disproportionately confess transgressions that reflect poorly on their character in ways connected to traits their community particularly values, a pattern consistent with confession functioning specifically as a signal calibrated to the particular cooperative concerns of the social group receiving it, rather than as an undifferentiated general release of psychological pressure, regardless of content. The developmental question of when this drive toward confession and disclosure first emerges has been examined by the developmental psychologist Victoria Talwar at McGill University, whose research on childhood lying and confession has documented that children as young as 3 or 4 years of age already show measurable discomfort maintaining a successful deception, and that this discomfort, along with the corresponding relief associated with confession, increases systematically with age as children's capacity for guilt and their understanding of the relational stakes involved in deception becomes more sophisticated, suggesting that the psychological architecture underlying adult confession behavior has developmental roots considerably earlier in childhood than the specific capacity for sophisticated verbal confession itself. What emerges from this substantial and multidisciplinary body of research is a picture of confession not as an occasional and specifically criminal justice relevant behavior, but as a fundamental expression of a deep and evolutionarily significant feature of human social psychology. The powerful drive to maintain alignment between one's private self-knowledge and one's public relational standing, a drive that motivates truthful disclosure even at direct personal cost in the vast majority of everyday cases, but that can, under conditions of extreme and sustained psychological pressure, be manipulated into producing confessions that bear no relationship to actual guilt whatsoever. The secret you have never told anyone, the one that occasionally surfaces uninvited in a quiet moment, carrying with it a small but persistent weight, is not simply an inert piece of withheld information. It is an active psychological cost, continuously extracted by the same evolved system that, in its extreme and manipulated form, can convince an innocent person that they committed a crime they know, somewhere beneath the accumulated pressure of hours of interrogation, they did not commit. The drive to confess is not a weakness in human psychology. It is the same fundamental commitment to honest relational standing that makes large-scale human trust possible in the first place, a commitment powerful enough to be a genuine liability under the wrong conditions, precisely because it is powerful enough to be one of the deepest and most reliable forces holding human social bonds together under the right ones. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. If you find this video interesting, please consider subscribing for more content like this.